there was another thing I think that you wrote that might be important to mention is that dreams are not necessarily about like what's going to happen in the future, but they're more so about your experience. So it's not
Right.
like it could be about you reading about an event that is a
Yep.
complete distortion of the actual event that happens, but your experience is going to be you reading that newspaper. So you're dreaming about you reading that newspaper, not about the actual event that's going to
Right.
happen.
Yeah, that's super important. I'm glad you brought that up. In fact, that's I think this is number one principle in the book, that dreams are about our experiences. They're about things that we are going to feel and think, uh, and see and so forth in our future. They're not about remote events happening in space time. Okay. So, lots of people dreamed about 9/11, for instance. I dreamed about 9/11, um, before it happened. But they're not dreaming about the planes crashing into the towers or whatever. That's their kind of an intuitive mental model, I think, of psychic phenomena, is that events happening in the world are they're somehow explosive, somehow ripple through space time, and we pick them up through some sort of psychic antenna. And that's not how it works. Like I said, precognition is an aspect of our memory. It's not a kind of perception. um, so in fact, what we're doing when we have a precognitive dream about 9/11, say, is we're dreaming about our reactions to seeing that unfold on CNN. And the thing is, there's ways you can tell the difference between actual events out in the world and the way we experience them or way we learn about them. And this was, if we have time, I'd like to talk a little bit about J.W. Dunn. He was really the pioneer of studying precognitive dreams, and he wrote a book in 1927 called An Experiment with Time. Is the name of his book. And now this he was a English aeronautical engineer. He was in the first days of essentially the aerospace industry, back designing some of the first airplanes in Britain. This was like right after the Wright brothers in the United States, and he was designing very early airplanes. In fact, early monoplanes. He was really interested in those, um, and he. Uh, but he also noticed that he dreamed often of events that were going to happen in the future. Um, for instance, he had a famous dream in 1900, I believe, when he was fighting in the Boer War in South Africa. He had a dream of and that he was on an island with a volcano that was about to blow, and he was running around trying to warn the French-speaking people on this island that 40,000 people were about to die. Um, or sorry, that 4,000 people were going to die. And a few days later, a newspaper was delivered, to um, his troop in the out in the bush, and the headline in the newspaper was 40,000 people die on the French island of Martinique in a volcano explosion. Okay, but this was just the first of many examples like that, that he recorded and studied, where he would read about some amazing thing in the newspaper and realize dreamed about it, and he started recording his dreams and sort of studying them. And he brought this really brilliant forensic engineer's mind to the problem. I'm like he would investigate plane crashes. I mean, he was friends with test pilots, and sometimes they would die in plane crashes, and he would investigate. He knew how to examine what happened in a plane crash, and he sort of brought that same mindset to understanding his dreams. And he realized, for instance, in the volcano dream, well, the ultimate death toll turned out to be something like 36,000 or something like that. But he had dreamed this specific series of four and a bunch of zeros, and that's exactly what he read in the newspaper. And he realized that he was not dreaming about that eruption. He was dreaming about his experience of reading the newspaper. And this is so key, because this is, again and again and again, when you study precognitive dreaming, it always turns out to be about people's learning experiences, not actual events. Another great example of this, there's a contemporary, um, what I call a precog, someone who's regularly dreams vividly about about future events. And in her case, it's air disasters. It's a woman named Elizabeth Crone, in who lives in Houston. She's a grandmother, and her story is incredible. She was struck by lightning in the parking lot of her synagogue back in 1988, and afterwards she started having regular precognitive dreams about plane crashes for the most part and disasters. But and she learned to like send them to herself in emails. Eventually she learned this, and there wasn't even email back in 88, but I mean she eventually learned to send herself these dreams in emails so she could kind of prove to herself that okay, that she dreamed this before she read about the story in the news. But her dreams are very specifically about the picture that she will read, that she will see online or in a newspaper. And for instance, her best example of this is she awoke from a dream. She was on a trip to Jerusalem with her husband, and she had a dream, like a very specific dream, that an American airliner landed in the water in New York, and the passengers were standing on the wings. And sure enough, like 6 hours later, what goes viral on the internet, but all these pictures of the miracle on the Hudson, where Chesley Sullenberger piloted to a safe landing on the Hudson River, and all the passengers were standing on the wings of the plane waiting to be picked up by boats. And so she was dreaming. She wasn't dreaming the event; she was dreaming those pictures. And this is true again and again and again in her examples. But it's a really central. I'm really glad you remember that, because that's like the most basic, I think, principle of precognition and precognitive dream work. That this is not perception, and that term extrasensory perception, it's misleading because it's not perception, and it has nothing to do with the senses. This is about memory, our memory that goes through time. Memory for things future.